Folk, you'll come across this question quite often. Is this really the end of capitalism?
Despite how awful this year has been, when you look back at the long view of history, things really aren't that bad.
Of course, if you were to compare today to that of living before the Industrial Revolution, human history, we are far better off today than what we've ever been in terms of our living conditions, etc. In terms of the economy, and I'm not talking about before the Industrial Revolution, we really aren't doing as great as a lot of people assume that we are. You've got a lot of people who support the mixed economy and seem to think that just because of all the reckless borrowing and spending, we've been doing it for so long so nothing could ever go wrong. It's this attitude that these young folk have. They are so naive. They think that just because nothing has seriously went wrong of the past 70 odd plus years, something isn't going to go wrong now. There's a very good reason for why there's been so much preparation and a gold war that's been going on. It will eventually meet its demise.
The author Steven Pinker made this case in a 2018 TED Talk where he pointed out that really by almost every indicator imaginable, things are going in the right direction.
Well, there's your answer, mate. You're taking it from this guy. This is the same man who tried to tell people on the Joe Rogan show, I'm pretty sure it was, where he spoke about the mixed economy. He was trying to say that capitalism could not deal with negative externalities. In other words, he completely ignores the presence of private property rights, which shows he doesn't even understand what he's talking about to begin with.
Life expectancy has gone up, child mortality has gone down, famine deaths are down, extreme poverty is down, war deaths are down, the number of people living in a democracy, up, homicide rates are down, motor vehicle deaths are down, plane crash deaths are down, occupational deaths are down, natural disaster deaths are down, literacy rates are up, work hours are down, housework hours are down, and even lightning strike deaths are down.
I can agree with you on those things in terms of how people are living today. I mean, I've not got any argument against our living conditions and how we're living far better off today. Our life is far safer today than what it was, over 100 years ago. We are certainly in a far better place in terms of our living conditions. You would be having a laugh if you're speaking about the economy.
Now, there's a lot of factors that can take credit in this rise, science being one of them, but one of them you have to point to and give credit to is the economic model that made all this possible. And the dominant economic model over the past 200 years has been capitalism.
And that is completely false. Capitalism is the separation of the economy from government. Capitalism is not rewarding failure and punishing success. Capitalism is not the merger between state and corporate power. Capitalism is not mercantilism that dominated the 19th century. Capitalism is not imperialism. It is not colonialism. Capitalism's got nothing to do with collectivism. You look at the definition of individualism and you will find that it defines the free market. You can even find the dictionary definition of capitalism that's clear, that defines the free market. Now, since the 1860s under Abraham Lincoln, you had been facing the creeping corporatism. In other words, you had been going on the road of a corporatist system and moving towards the more mixed-based economy. That is not a capitalist system.
But like the rest of us, capitalism isn't having its best year right now. In fact, many people are making the argument that it's on its way out, having entered its final stage, what they call late-stage capitalism.
Take, for example, the banking crisis. A lot of people were erroneously claiming that deregulation caused the banking crisis, even although the Financial Services Authority were the UK banking regulator, and between 2001 to 2012, their handbook was more than 10,500 pages long in regulations. Does that sound like deregulation of the banks to you? The point being is the crisis itself happened because whole thing to do with bad banks becoming too big to fail. Why? Because of the continuous bailouts of the banks. The continuous subsidising. What the hell has all the subsidising got to do with capitalism? Every single time when some crisis comes along, capitalism gets the blame for it. Let's use this for example. What about the booms and busts of the 20th century? What caused that? Well, what caused that was, of course, the fixing of the interest rates. Now tell me something, Joe. What on earth has that got to do with a capitalist system? What's that got to do with capitalism? When these people talk about late-stage capitalism, as if they say capitalism was responsible for that, it's just laughable. Because what is capitalism? Capitalism is leaving it to the free market. That means leaving interest rates be free to the marketplace, leaving the market be for interest rates to be regulated freely in the marketplace. It does not mean taking some central authority, some central body, political centralisation, central bank, and then using that to start fixing interest rates. How's it free market to fix interest rates and control it? If you're controlling something, it's the antithesis of liberty, isn't it? Because you're controlling it. So how's that the free market? It's not the free market at all. There's the definition of capitalism. And yes, it does pertain to that of the free market. Now, capitalism is an individualist system. You cannot pull capitalism outside of individualism. How can capitalism have anything at all to do with collectivism? Capitalism's an individualist system. It defines the freedom of the economy from government's intervention, from state control or anything to do with government regulation. What do you mean capitalism's having its problems? It's not the fault of capitalism. You're living under a corporatist system. That's not capitalism. When you intervene through all the socialist government interventionism, you're going to create problems in the economy, because to imply that it's the fault of capitalism is to imply that interest rates are left be free to the marketplace. Having a central banking system controlling and manipulating your interest rates is not capitalism. Fixing the ratio of money is not capitalism.
Alright, so this is going to be a video about capitalism. We're going to take an honest look at capitalism, the good points and the bad points. We're going to be critical of it, and if there's anything that I know from 6 years on YouTube, is that some people really hate when you're critical of capitalism.
It's not that you are critical of capitalism, it's the arguments that you use to critique capitalism with. Someone turning around and saying fixing interest rates has somehow got something to do with capitalism, or someone saying that setting down price ceilings or price floors has got something to do with capitalism. Those are the things that we have reason to be mad about, because they're false claims.
This will be triggering for some of you. Because here in the US, throughout the decades of the Cold War, we've been taught, trained, indoctrinated, whatever word works for you, to believe that capitalism is the same as democracy itself. That capitalism and America are intrinsically linked, and to criticize capitalism is the same as urinating on the flag.
Again, Joe, when it comes down to it, a lot of people don't even understand what capitalism is. But to say that the United States of America of the past 100, maybe even 150 odd years has been something capitalist is just rather strange, to say the least. Yes, it was capitalism that was certainly responsible for the growth of your living conditions and how your wages have improved, etc. You've been faced with all of this government intervention in so many regards. You could even go back to the antitrust laws, and then you saw the creation of all these monopolies like the American Medical Association monopoly. I mean, that's anti-capitalism, not capitalism.
And there are many different types of economic systems around the world, and there's many different types of capitalism around the world.
No, there isn't, Joe. There is only one capitalism, and that is to do with the free market. Again, the dictionary definitions are very clear. Not just of individualism, but of that of capitalism itself. It's an individualist system. That isn't up for debate. You can't say that capitalism's got anything to do with collectivism. Collectivism is the antithesis of everything capitalism stands for. Individualism is very clear of its definition. It means the separation of the economy from government. It basically means the free market. What you're faced with today is this cronyist system. It's economic fascism. Fascism as a political ideology is inherently collectivist. Again, it's anti-individualist. It's anti-capitalist. You're not living under a capitalist system or any type of capitalism. You're just living under this sort of mixed system that bastardized capitalism, strangled it half to death. And I think this picture illustrates best of the type of system you live under today.
Alright, so late stage capitalism. You may have seen this as a hashtag in various social media places. It's usually used to highlight hyper-consumerism and class divide, although people have now started to kind of use it ironically as just a way of saying that society sucks right now. Basically, it means something different for everyone. My boss only gave me a 3% raise. Hashtag late stage capitalism.
And it was created through their socialism. Their socialism was responsible for driving your country so far in debt. It then drove private sector costs through the roof through all the socialist government interventionism, and yes, it was through all the fractional reserve banking, that devaluation of the currency, stripping away free market money, which was gold and silver, and thanks to all their socialist government interventionism, crippling people and soaring debt with all the free goodies, such as the free NHS, the free education, the free prescriptions. And if it wasn't bad enough with all of that, it was then the social security that was crippling the poor half to death. It's like this argument with American healthcare costs. That's a bit like saying, oh, it's capitalism's fault in the presence of a private sector, that's why American healthcare costs are so expensive, and this is somehow late stage capitalism. Rubbish.
Growing disparity between the wealthy and ultra-wealthy are taking money away from the lower classes, causing them to precipitously shrink as they consolidate both power and wealth. Actually, that is late-stage capitalism.
Joe, the same claim was made about that of capitalism of the 19th century. It was even made that of the 1970s to the 1990s, during when Ronald Reagan would become the president of the United States. All of these erroneous claims came around saying that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. Between 1968 to the 1990s, they actually surveyed about 50,000 odd families or whatever, and what they discovered was the bottom 20%, measuring between 1975 to that of 1991, most of the bottom 20%, where only 5% were left behind, but most of the bottom 20% moved up the ladder by $27,000 plus in wages, whilst in that same time period, the highest income earners, the richest, only increased by $4,000 plus. In other words, what was discovered was the rich grew richer and the poor grew richer faster. And that was during a period of Ronald Reagan. That's why you never take these people seriously who make baseless claims and just fling it around, and they think that just by claiming such a thing makes it true.
For some, it's Black Friday stampedes. For others, it's a prison industrial complex. For others, it's people having to do GoFundMe campaigns to get diabetes medicine for their kids.
Well, Joe, capitalism would actually solve that problem. The whole thing with Black Friday and people rushing out is because people are struggling to get by. It's harder to come by employment within today's current corporatist system, and I can understand when rushing out for getting things for their kids for Christmas and whatnot. With a capitalist system, it dramatically reduces their cost of living.
It's the feeling that our capitalist system has completely stopped working for all but the very few at the top, while the rest of us, stare down at our phones, burying our head in the sand of mindless consumerism, while the fabric of our society unravels slowly around us.
People can make all sorts of baseless claims, just like they've been doing of recent, claiming that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And they get away with making these baseless claims because people don't know any better, right? They just believe it. If you tell people who don't know any better and you just repeat a lie over and over and over, they'll begin to believe it, and they make those same baseless claims. You live under a system that had basically caused the banking crisis. The banking crisis would never have happened if you lived under a capitalist system.
The term late capitalism was first coined in 1902 by the author Werner Sombart in his 3-volume book Der moderne Kapitalismus, also known as Historische Systematische Darstellung des...
Yeah, I really wouldn't take anything of what it says seriously. I know that there was a libertarian class within that of Germany at one point in the 19th century. They were defeated by that of Otto von Bismarck, and then you saw the introduction of the welfare state, and then, of course, you see that about the history of the socialist Weimar Republic and how it hit hyperinflation, and then you saw another big socialist regime of that of Nazi Germany. That's why I would not take it seriously, has written some load of nonsense of anti-capitalist crap.
Sombart believed that capitalism relied on boom and bust cycles in order to exist, and he named the stages of those cycles early, high, and late capitalism. He believed that a capitalist society has to, quote, ceaselessly devalue existing wealth, whether through war, dereliction, or regular and periodic economic crises, in order to clear the ground for the creation of new wealth, which he called creative destruction.
And there you have it, Joe. It's just clarified and proved my point. The guy was a socialist. The guy was an anti-capitalist. This guy goes on about the booms and busts. The 19th century saw the booms and busts due to the trying and testing of the paper currency, not because of gold and silver. Now, see, see, if capitalism was left be, there wouldn't have been all of those problems throughout the 19th century with the booms and busts. How the hell has fixing interest rates got to do with that of capitalism? This is a guy who just talks socialist nonsense.
The engine of capitalism to turn, society has to constantly replace old product with new product, whether it's needed or not.
Anyone who thinks capitalism is about you can just produce whatever the hell you like and throw it out there whether people like it or not is just clueless about capitalism to begin with. I mean, who says that businesses can just do that? And what incentive is there for them to do so when there's risks involved? How do you gain a profit? You gain a profit by producing something that consumers do want, that they're going to buy. You're not going to produce something, risk throwing it out there, only to find that it's not selling and that's you facing losses.
So you could say he wasn't capitalism's biggest fan, which shouldn't be a surprise because he was a follower of Karl Marx.
So what exactly was the point in pointing to his material? Obviously he's going to talk crap as someone who's basically influenced by Karl Marx. Of course he's going to talk utter shite.
An entire video on Marx would only scratch the surface, but at the basest of base levels, he didn't like capitalism because he thought that it would create a stratified society where the minority upper class would benefit by exploiting the lower majority working class. And to him, the answer was communism. All right, so I know that here in the States we've been trained for decades to basically vomit in our mouth at the mention of Karl Marx and his ideas, but it's not hard to imagine why at that particular moment in history, his ideas were pretty popular.
At that time, we never saw the likes of the Soviet Union. You didn't see the Soviet Union till 1917. So communism was, in a sense, still to be put into practice. The ideas, however, of the communal ownership had already been tried and tested and caused the starvation.
The world had industrialized, seemingly overnight, and society was still struggling to catch up. Child labor was normal, the average workday was 16 hours with no weekend, wages were below the poverty line, safety rules and regulations were non-existent, deaths and dismemberments on the job were common, with no social safety net.
Joe, I'm not going to go on about the whole thing to do with the Industrial Revolution because it could cover a whole topic in its own. Countless number of myths that you could go through. The mention about the work week hours, for example. Before the Industrial Revolution, people were working more than 80 hours per week. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, you saw a massive decline of the workweek hours, right up to that of the 20th century. The second erroneous claim was to do with the wages, saying they were getting paid below the poverty line. What are you talking about? Before the Industrial Revolution, they were getting paid substantially less, and it was unprecedented. Even their living conditions were dramatically improving. We've got the concession of a socialist historian, E.P. Thompson, to concede to the fact that the living conditions were better off in the 1840s compared to where they came from 50 years prior to then. How can anybody look at this graph and say that they were living below the poverty line? What do you think life was like before the 1780s? Unbelievable how anybody could even make such a baseless claim as that.
City populations exploded, leading to overcrowded shanty towns, muddy streets caked with horse manure, choking smog, overwhelmed sewer systems, undrinkable water, and cholera outbreaks.
You seriously do not have a clue what life was like before the Industrial Revolution then. It was far worse than that of the conditions that you just described there. Yes, you're looking at these conditions and speaking about, oh, how awful those living conditions are from the luxury of what you're living in today. Yeah, if you're going to compare, how they lived back then to how you're living today, then obviously you're going to say it's awful, aren't you? But how do you think they lived when they lived in the hovels? Before individualism, what dominated world history was that of governments. You could take Scotland as a prime example. We were living under feudalism. It was a top-down structural system, and what ruled was the aristocracy. So going by your logic, we would have been facing an industrial revolution before then. But isn't it funny, as soon as we gain more and more freedom from government, along comes the Industrial Revolution, the fastest growing period in human history. And even on child labour, etc., we could point out the evidence that the market solved the problem long before government's, legislation.
And cholera outbreaks, and cholera outbreaks, and cholera outbreaks, and cholera outbreaks. Oh, and cholera outbreaks.
Joe, one of the main reasons why our health and living conditions improved was the freedom for people to think. And one of the main reasons, take for example Glasgow and how we would get our water. We would take it from Loch Katrine and then of course from Loch Lomond, and of course they would switch it about. Before then they never had the luxury of all of that. What got rid of so many of the diseases, how many of the cures would come around, was through medical discoveries. That was thanks to the market. That was thanks to capitalism that did that. That wasn't anything to do with government. It's all to do with, technological improvement, the medical discoveries, all of these things that helped improve people's living conditions and their health.
And wealth inequality skyrocketed as robber barons built business empires that rivaled the empires of old.
And again, I've already covered the whole thing on the robber barons myth, all to do with the antitrust law myths and everything to do with the crap, claiming that they held these monopolies, etc., when in real fact they never. Secondly, the myth that there was a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. Even although 70% of the wealth was going to the workers, and of course 30% to that of the capital factory owners, etc. And this was between 1840 to 1900. Wealth remained the same. There was no dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. That entire claim that you've made is based off the mainstream false narrative that the likes of Rockefeller and your Vanderbilt somehow held monopolies when they never.
Monarchies were replaced by monopolies. It was the opinion of most people that things needed to change. People clamored for a solution, and Marx gave it to them.
Wrong. What happened was the government's intervention actually gave rise to the very monopolies that you were complaining about. And the monopolies weren't even there to begin with. You see, the antitrust law legislation was brought in to break up supposed monopolies. The antitrust law legislation that was brought in to break up the supposed monopolies actually laid the groundwork for what would follow with all of these monopolies, etc. It's why you're living under this monopolistic system today. I mean, judging by your logic, all of that government's intervention would have prevented monopolies from forming. What communism created was the deaths of countless millions of people and the absolute abysmal poverty that you would see. Right, folks, from what he's basically explaining through all of this, I'm not going to go into the whole thing to do with his argument here. Just briefly, he starts going on about this to do with, of course, the 1500s and to do with the time period before and feudalism, etc. And again, it's all down to this thing as if to say this is where capitalism developed from. No, capitalism developed from the old days of meritocracy, barter, the trade, etc. That's where capitalism developed from. It did not develop from this to do with feudalism. Anybody who thinks that capitalism developed from some collectivist system are having a laugh. Feudalism was inherently socialist. It had the strong communal ownership, the central planner, of course, what a big part of what defines socialism, and the political centralisation. Folk, for the rest of his video, he just goes on about everything to do with what's describing corporatism and the problems about affording life and whatnot. I mean, what's that got to do with capitalism anyway? When he speaks about that of the Industrial Revolution, damaging such equipment and all the, labour unions and the complaints against the wages, etc. The Industrial Revolution wasn't a period, where you would see the free market being left be. There was the constant intervention. You would see problems with that of the government subsidies, etc. You're hearing him speaking about all of these problems that you hear today, and again, it's just getting projected off onto capitalism. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that the free market is not the cause of the problem. No one says that a capitalist system is based on pure perfection, and no one's saying that exploitation cannot exist or corruption. To blame capitalism for what you're living under today is just going way off topic. And whilst I could go through each one of these points, this video would go on forever and there would be no point in me doing so. So anyway, folk, I'm just going to go into the comments. PB goes on to mention, the people who claim to advocate for regulated capitalism are simply just clueless about economics. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, really all of what it is, it leads in the road of corporatism. The strong government regulation is what gives rise to all of these problems, such as the collusions, the monopolies, the oligopolies, etc. Yet they think that that as the solution to the problem, yet the best performing economies have all been those which are the freest from government intervention. Shane Killian goes on to mention, Vicky's whole video is a bogus appeal to nature and can be completely disregarded on that basis as pseudo-intellectual drivel. I completely agree with you, Shane. I know exactly where you're coming from. The reason why I mentioned about, the human nature, human life before that of the Industrial Revolution, she doesn't understand the fact that people didn't live that way just by some sort of choice. They lived that way because life was horrid. They had no choice but to work more than 80 hours per week. They were living in survival mode at the time. Their life expectancy was absolutely horrid. These people make it sound like before the Industrial Revolution was some sort of fashion statement or something. It goes down to that whole romanticised view of that period of history. GH20 goes on to say, can you explain why people say why Venezuela isn't a socialist country? Well, GH20, like I've mentioned many times before, the whole thing to do with the Soviet Union, for example, in the 1930s, it faced its honeymoon period. You would look at Venezuela as a prime example throughout Hugo Chavez's period as president, that a lot of socialists proclaimed that this was, a democratic paradise. You would hear all of these socialists boasting off about Venezuela, and that was the case because whenever a country seems to be doing reasonably well as they like to think it is, then of course they'll latch on and say, oh, here's an example of how socialism is working, look how democratic it is. Socialists will paint a very different picture during its honeymoon phase to that of a phase later when the failure becomes so noticeable that it becomes so difficult for them to even deny it. Explaining to them why it's a socialist country, well, of course it was a socialist country. This was a country that was rife with that of government's intervention, government's controls over prices and all sorts. And of course it would, nationalise, it would, take control over the groceries, they were state-owned, etc. That's not to say that there wasn't, these co-ops that were operating similar to that of private companies. I have heard that before, but there was a lot of the country that was being controlled, directed by the state, and it's why they ended up in the mess that they did. Take, for example, the socialist price controls. So that's the point. There's a very big difference between that of what they would say, during its honeymoon phase to that of when the failure becomes so ever noticeable. Anybody who denies that Venezuela was a socialist or is a socialist country are just out of their mind, because in their head, socialism is what they idealise it to be, their aspirations, not what it is in the real world. Adin Sihik goes on to say, the reason the USA had a high literacy rate in the 19th century was because of Protestantism, not free market capitalism. Protestantism encourages everyone to read the Bible, which increases literacy. Well, that statement about the Protestantism isn't entirely true, because at the end of the day, Protestantism just happened to enable individual liberty to a varying degree. The Scottish Enlightenment, when you saw more and more individual liberty, people had the freedom to think for themselves, the freedom to choose, and that's the very reason they had the freedom to, independently study and whatnot, and that's why Scotland became the world leaders of medicine and education. But when you give people the freedom to, become educated, and the beauty of the free market education system is it doesn't deal with these classes of about 30 odd pupils where teachers can't get through every single student. That's the problem with state education, where sometimes teachers can't even get through every single student that they would more than love to. It's not the teacher's fault, it's more often than not the fault of how the system is. The great thing about the free market education system is there's more of that one-to-one interaction between the teacher and the student, and of course that helps them a hell of a lot. If that was the case, that high literacy rate would have remained there. So anyway, folk, I hope it's been educational enough for yourself. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you've got anything you would like to add in yourself, any points you might want to make or that, feel free to comment in the comment section below. I'm always more than welcome to your own input and everything, even if it's some critiques or whatever. Anyway, thank you for watching. I shall talk to you later. Cheers.